shot like champagne, Cap.
Good evening, everyone. Are we ready to begin the meeting? Then I'll call the meeting to order and say welcome to everyone who is here and all the members of the public that have come to listen to our discussion tonight and to participate also. We're going to have a study session on the budget, and the first item, please, is the roll call.
Councilmember Story.
Here.
Councilmember Bottorff.
Here.
Councilmember Termini.
Here.
Mayor Harlan.
Here. Can I add an item, just oral communications or not, if there are any oral communications?
Yes, you can.
Can we just add that to every meeting that we have,
Sure, we will have a meeting tomorrow if there's announcements of general interest, but you obviously have the prerogative of making announcements as the mayor at a meeting like this.
Yeah, I think most of them we should make probably tomorrow night if we have any, because there will be more members of the public. But I just wanted to give anyone an opportunity to make an announcement tonight if there was anything that they wanted the public to know about. Are there any announcements from council members?
Save it for tomorrow night.
Okay. Councilmember Norton is going to be late, but he'll be here. So tonight is our first public hearing and discussion of the budget, and what we have planned is to receive the information, hear from department heads if they have any questions to answer from council members, and just to review the information, and then we will actually have more of an in-depth discussion at our next meeting. But tonight is just an overview from the staff members and to ask any clarifying questions and not to give direction and not to make any decisions tonight. Any questions about that? Okay, then we'll begin with City Council, the City Manager, Jamie.
Council members and Madam Mayor, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to do a budget presentation in a slightly different format than maybe historically has been done. It is a format that I think we've used recently where the Finance Director and I are going to present an overview of the budget tonight. The department heads are here and available to answer your questions. I think, as the Mayor properly pointed out, this isn't any final decision this evening. If you have specific research items or direction that you'd like us to come back with more information, other budget alternatives, you can give that sort of direction from the dais here this evening, things that you'd like to see us put a little bit more time and effort into or bring back additional information. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tori, who's going to walk you through the budget. I will have a few concluding remarks, and then we'll turn it over to the council for comments and questions.
So the presentation format of the budget, we're just going to do an overview of the city's general fund finances, look at any significant changes or highlights, and then we're going to also look at the reserves and some of the projections on how we can replenish those. We're going to look at the individual key revenues and expenditures, and then we're going to look at the calendar to see what meetings are coming up next, and then ask for direction to staff. So this budget was designed with the core budget principles of public improvement, public safety, and public service and fiscal policy. Some of the highlights for the fiscal year 13 and fiscal year 14 is fiscal year 13-14 is a balanced budget, and in fiscal year 14-15 we actually have a surplus of about $108,000. Some of the key changes include Measure O sales tax revenues of just over $1 million, and we have corresponding expenditures. We'll go into detail on those in the next few slides. We also have a sales tax true-up and increased performance in sales tax that increased tax revenue about $370,000 between the adopted and the proposed budget. Incorporated in this budget is also revenue that's anticipated from the Lower Pacific Cove parking lot, along with the estimated debt service. One thing you'll notice as we go into the salaries, you'll see that salaries have increased by $291,000 from fiscal year 12-13 adopted to 13-14 proposed. We'll also be looking later on at those individual changes as well as some of the changes that have occurred from the estimated budget to the proposed budget. This is the first year that we've included some funding for other post-employment benefits. We placed $30,000 in the budget in the transfer line, and this will be funding OPEB at the 50% funding level. So this would allow us to put aside some funds for the long-term liability. We've also placed $166,000 in transfer items to the IT and the equipment funds to help start replenishing. As you recall, last year we borrowed about $400,000 of those to help meet our reserve funding goals.
Just a little bit more information about the OPEB contribution. What this is, this comes out of some new GASB reporting requirements that requires the city to total up and look at the total amount of health insurance assistance that we provide to to retirees. The city currently provides retirees with the minimum amount allowed in the law, and so the city's obligations, if you will, looking forward are relatively minor. That said, we have always in the past operated on a pay-as-you-go model. That is, we budgeted in the amount of money that was going to go out the door that given year. With the new GASB reporting requirements that requires the city to total up and look at 30 years worth of these payments, also comes sort of a nice little piece for cities is that you can pre-fund them. And by pre-funding them, what that allows you to do, as us to do, is it allows us to basically get the power of a higher rate of return by pre-funding it. So it's a nice little mechanism that allows us to start to reduce down long-term benefit, long-term obligation, and use the power of the markets to help reduce it. And this is the first year, as Tori pointed out, that we've included this in the budget, but it is something that I think is prudent to consider.
And could you give us the full name of the acronym so the people watching at home will know what it is?
The acronym is OPEB, which is Other Post-Employment Retirement Benefits, and specifically what it is totals up for the city of Capitola the amount of money that the city is obligated to give retirees. And as I pointed out before, this retirees for health insurance, and currently the city gives out the minimum amount by law. So we don't have a plan right now where retirees are offered full health benefits for life, anything like that. It's the minimum amount, which I think is about $140 a month.
Thank you.
And going into the adopted versus estimated budget, you'll see originally we were projecting a positive fund balance of about $508,000. And when you look at the net difference in the 12 to 13 estimated year-end figures, you'll see that the net difference between operating revenues and expenditures is about $500,000. That $500,000 really equates to the Department of Finance clawbacks that we've talked about earlier in the year. The first clawback for about $152,000 related to city RDA interest. And then they went back another period and took back close to an additional $48,000. Also, at yes?
Excuse me, I was just the additional $48,000. What was the rationale for that? I guess I didn't recall that they'd actually come back and demanded more from us.
That was a second Department of Finance finding, separate from the original one. And we had a meet and confer with the folks in Sacramento at the Department of Finance, where I specifically went up there and talked to them about it and explained to them what the issue was. Basically what the story was is that the city made payments on its co-op loan in 2011 prior to the adoption of the law in Sacramento. And whether it was through a coding error by the city when the forms came out from the Department of Finance, or simply the Department of Finance taking what I view as an untenable position, they reached back in time and said that the city was prepaying on that loan. I pointed out in my individual meeting with them that this was a payment the city had made year in and year out, and that the law wasn't in effect and wouldn't be appropriate for them to dismiss the payment. They did so anyway. And asked for the $50,000 or demanded the $50,000 back. So it was associated with the payment on the co-op loan in the period prior to the legislation had been adopted.
Do we have any recourse to challenge that decision?
At this point, we've exhausted our administrative process. We could pursue something legal. However, we do have a state controller's office audit coming up in July. Now, I don't know if they could reverse any of the Department of Finance decisions. I've heard in some situations they have, to the positive and to the negative. And after that, we should receive our finding of completion.
We're not running up against any statute of limitations at this point to challenge legally. As Tori pointed out, we've run through our administrative remedies. So at this point, the next step on these issues, assuming the state controller's office doesn't reverse the Department of Finance, would be to litigate. The nice thing, if it's nice, if there's any silver lining here, is that there are hundreds of cases around the state of cities suing the Department of Finance. They're all moving through the courts, and my opinion is that with the settlement of those cases will be a relatively clearly established framework that resolves all of these issues, so that should the city in the future wish to file, presumably the costs would be relatively minor, and on top of that, I think it would be potentially possible to settle out relatively quickly if it was much more settled case law by that point.
Okay, so maybe we could bookmark this to be sure that we follow, particularly when the state controller audits happen, maybe have some dialogue at that time, but follow the, I guess, proceedings and the precedent that are established in the next budget year.
Yeah, and you will recall that the city utilizes outside counsel for redevelopment agencies who does represent many of the cities around the state, and so they are litigating a lot of these. And so we're abreast and talking with Barbara Couts frequently about this, whether it would be prudent at this time to move forward with litigation or not. And I think the state controller's office is going to give us a lot of real clear sense about whether we want to do that or not, depending on what they say about the Rispin property, frankly.
Okay, thank you.
And just for Dennis's benefit, let me give him the information. We're just receiving the information tonight. We're not going to make any decisions. We're just going to receive the information, ask questions. Department heads are here. They're not going to make individual presentations, but if we have questions about something in their budget, we can ask that, and then we'll begin the deliberations at our next meeting. But no decisions tonight, just information, clarification, and so forth.
Thank you, Stephanie. I apologize for being late.
That's okay.
Do we have copies of this?
I can get you copies of the presentation.
Okay.
Good, thank you.
And the additional of that $500,000, you'll see additional $350,000 was transferred to reserves based on council's recommended decision earlier this year, and then also the parking meter retrofit project, which was funded through the property tax administrative fee settlement, which was a one-time additional revenue. Going into fiscal year 13-14, we have a balanced budget, slight residual. We'll go into details of what that includes. And in fiscal year 14-15, we actually come up with a little bit of a surplus, and we'll also talk about what is included in that particular budget. Some items that were labeled as discretionary last year are listed here with the fiscal year 12-13 budgeted amount as well as the proposed planned amount. You can see the reserves are, and the CIP is going to be 100% funded with Measure O funds. Community grant funding and the Chamber, Begonia, Bike to Work, and United Way are all maintained at their last year's budgeted levels. This does not restore them to their original levels. It was just budgeted as status quo. We're projecting just over $1 million in Measure O revenues for the fiscal year 13-14 and 14-15 budget. All of the Measure O revenues have been applied to cover expenses, and pretty much they're based on the same allocation. We have about 48% going to CIP and street maintenance, about 45% going to reserves, and a small portion going to cover public works crew position and the police staffing position, which was changing a parking enforcement officer to a community service officer. The proposed projects with Measure O funding for this current fiscal year, along with the following 2 years, are presented above. The total 5-year allocation is $2.24 million, which is going to CIP. The reserve funding plan, which is listed on page 26 of your document, follows the funding plan that the city manager presented earlier in this year. It allows us to be fully funded in your fiscal year 2017. In fiscal year 13-14, out of the emergency reserve fund, we'll have $200,000 being transferred to the CIP fund to fund the retaining wall project. There might have been some concerns last year of the status of the internal service and other funds, because we did take $400,000 from them to assist with the reserve replenishment. Based on the current year's budget and transferring some additional funds into information technology and the equipment fund, it looks like we're getting back on track. In fiscal year 15, there's only $10,000 in planned purchases in the equipment fund, which allows it again to start regaining some momentum as far as funding goes. We presented this chart last year to show how much of the city departments are supported by program revenues. Again, recreation is close to 92% self-funded, and then community development and building is close to 61%. If you looked at all city departments and looked at all program revenues, you'd see that the overall city functions are 21.1% supported by program revenues, rather than just general fund tax dollars. So for revenues, we'll go into individual details and what went into some of the projections, but largely taxes is increased due to Measure O and due to increased sales tax performance. License and permits has slightly dropped. That's because we did have to give a refund in fiscal year 12-13 for some building and permit estimates. Intergovernmental revenues in fiscal year 12-13 is slightly higher because we do have a reimbursement coming in from another organization. It is one time to help offset the cost of the pipe repair project, and also some grant funds in that year which aren't necessarily in fiscal year 13-14. Charges for services are slightly reduced, are actually slightly going up in fiscal year 13-14. A large portion of that is due to retaining more staff now in community development. We're fully filling the community director position, which is partially funded through the general plan reimbursements. So you'll see that piece coming in as additional charges for services. The only other significant changes are the other financing sources. In fiscal year 12-13, we had a one-time land sale of $85,000, which it appears might be coming in slightly higher, closer to $110,000, I believe. And then in fiscal year 11-12, you'll see $248,000. That was a transfer in from the Emergency Reserve Fund. During that particular year, there were several transfers of going in and out to help fund the flood recovery projects. Fiscal year 13-14, we're estimating tax at 3% year over year. One thing you'll notice is that the Measure O sales tax revenues are in the lightest color that's on that chart. In addition, you'll see Measure D revenues. If we were to look at Measure D and the Bradley-Burns tax all the way across, in fiscal year 7-8, our sales tax revenue was $6.5 million at its best year. We're getting close to approaching that. We're going to be at close to just over $6 million in fiscal year 13-14.
That's just with the Bradley-Burns and the Measure D portion. Measure O puts us ahead. And the distinction between Measure D, Measure O, and the Bradley-Burns is mostly for education purposes. It's not a financial difference. It's all general fund revenue. But we broke it down here just so people could see sort of what was going on with the sales tax.
Right, and that the largest trend was really a jump, not just a better performance in general.
Let me just ask a quick question. On page 32, it talks about sales tax projected to rise by 6.9% in 13-14, followed by a 3.5% increase in 14-15.
Part of that is due because that would be the overall figure. In our estimates held constant, it would be that number year over year, but what has happened is there's also additional $175,000, which was in that 6%, I believe, and that $175,000 is based on an additional true-up that's coming in this year. Typically, we don't receive one that large, but if you'll recall, last year, towards the end of the year, we had significant sales tax improvement, so it's related to the whole triple flip reimbursement that comes back to us.
So it's the additional monies that increase every year.
Yes.
What's the county projecting for sales tax increase overall?
I would have to check to see what the county is looking at. We've looked at our revenue projections based on our experience level, and also we use Muni Services, which is a consulting firm for our sales tax, and we've looked at their estimates as well.
Okay, thanks.
When you bore down into sales tax, it's a very messy picture and involves a lot of different pieces, the triple flip, and that's what the true-up payment that Tori was talking about. But the basic underlying assumption that we used for the budget was a 3% year-over-year growth.
Thank you.
Property tax trends in working at the county, they're estimated 1.6% growth prior to the residual distributions. And here we also outlined the residual distributions in a different color just to show that that property tax is not going down. There were some residual pieces that we received back from the RDA dissolution. For instance, when there are additional funds that are for us particularly, they had taken back some funds, or we didn't get our complete distribution of close to $500,000. What happens is they take that money and they transfer it back to all the other taxing entities. So although they took $500,000 from our successor agency account, they gave the general fund and some of the residual some of the other taxing entities those proceeds. Our share was about $52,000, and it seems to be averaging close to 10%. So while we're trying to maximize this as a go-forward basis, we really don't anticipate any clawbacks. We don't think that we will have that in fiscal year 13-14 or 14-15. We didn't plan on those additional pieces.
But down the road, when the RDA is fully wrapped up in 2016, 2017, at that point, then the property taxes would be anticipated to flow as they would otherwise, and the city would receive a bump of, somewhere in the order of probably $150,000 property tax bump. So if there's a silver lining, it's the general fund does receive some benefit out of the RDA dissolution.
And what year was that dissolution?
Oh, so that'll come about when all of the obligations of the former RDA are paid off, and I think that our current forecasts show that around 16, 17, if I remember correctly.
And maybe the council at that time would consider using that money for affordable housing so we can try to continue an affordable housing program here in Capitola.
TOT is estimated at a 2% increase prior to adjustments. If earlier in the year we talked about a hotel, an internal hotel adjustment of about $48,000, which bumped it up this year, but it's something that we don't want to necessarily plan for ongoing. It was related to rebates from frequent stays, almost a catch-up. So while their revenues are going slightly up, it just won't be in that large of a portion. Parking meters and citations. We've held parking citations relatively firm at the current levels. It looks like it's going to meet its fiscal year 12-13 projection, but because there's so much uncertainty, we decided to keep it fairly flat through 13-14 and 14-15. There is an increase in parking meter revenues, primarily due to the opening of the lower Pacific Cove parking lot. We're planning on 30% of the upper lots rate in fiscal year 13-14, and we're planning on revenues at 50% of the upper lots rate in 14-15.
And these are the current parking meter rates, no changes to the current, and it's assuming that the lower Pac Cove rate that's applied is the same as the upper Pac Cove rate that we have today.
And expenditures, will go into details, especially a little bit on the staffing, because that did jump from 7.4 to 7.7 in fiscal year 13-14. When we gave this presentation to the Finance Advisory Committee, they also asked why did it jump from 7.3 to 7.7. So we'll be looking at those numbers in the next couple of slides. You'll also see that contract services has been reduced, and the primary driver on that is reduction in litigation fees that had occurred in fiscal year 13-14. We had to increase the budget that year to handle some of the closure fees. Other than that, everything else is relatively stable except for the transfers, and the transfers are primarily related to the Measure O funding, corresponding increases in transfers to the CIP and reserves in relation to those dollars. Expenditures by department, police still retains the highest share of the pie. However, their share was reduced slightly from last year. And expenditures by department, just looking at those, City Council is relatively constant in fiscal year 12-13. There was the election, so there was a slight increase in that year. Some of the larger increases you'll see is in Public Works, where we've added some of the Measure O funded positions, and in Community Development, where we're fully staffing the Community Development Director. Personnel services increased 3.9% over fiscal year 12-13, or 5.78 over fiscal year 12-13 estimated, and we'll see details on those changes. Fiscal year 14 planned includes a 2.5% estimated CPI-based COLA. So we've just assumed that it might be 2.5%. We're not certain, but those are some of the assumptions that went into the numbers. So the key personnel changes. We have a maintenance, and this is between fiscal year 12-13 estimated to fiscal year 13-14 proposed, and we can also work this back to adopted. But one of the questions that came up with the Finance Advisory Committee is how come it's changed by about $400,000 between the estimated to the fiscal year 13 proposed. We've added a maintenance worker 1-2, which is Measure O funded. We've changed a parking enforcement officer to a community service officer, which is also Measure O funded. We've added an environmental projects manager that's offset by 0.33 of a development services tech position. So what you see is the value of the 0.667. This 0.667 of a position is also offset by the contract savings of $20,000. It's ongoing stormwater contract fees. So you could say the full cost of the position is around $48,000. However, included in the budget, there's close to $53,000 in unallocated funds for the remaining 67% of the position. We're currently trying to see how that may work out. Originally, it was a development services tech percentage that was assigned to community development, but right now we're trying to allocate some of the responsibilities between the finance department and the receptionist position, and we're trying to see how that goes. Whether we can work something out, it's to be determined. We really need to see how that impacts community development and how that service level goes. But if by some chance that it was found that we could do without that or do with only a part of it, then it would be cost neutral and actually amount to some savings when you input that cost, the contract savings along with that. In the employee contracts, flex benefits were negotiated for between $25 to $50 increases to help offset health care cost in this particular fiscal year. We estimate that to be around $26,000 that had changed. The receptionist adjustment, last year we had a receptionist retire, and as part of a retirement incentive agreement, part of that was transferred to compensated absences. So while it was a decrease in the overall salary budget, it was not a decrease in the city manager's budget. That line item just moved to a different location. So when you see that column called category changes, those are items that just really change from, say, personnel services to contract services or to some other category. It just shows that it's an increase in the personnel line, but it may not be an overall increase to the budget. There's an additional 0.25 police records clerk, which will start mid-year. And the police chief or the city manager may want to go into that a little bit further, but that will allow the police department staffing window to be open the full regular hours rather than closing down for half of the day on Fridays. The contract service to temporary salaries, we had a contract with somebody who should more or less be classified as a temporary employee due to some of the PERS regulations. So really, we're canceling the contract services line and moving that to the salary line. And this is not a position that should be affected by the new Affordable Health Care Act. This one would stay under those requirements. We also have changes in the Community Development Director position. Last year, we budgeted for 45% of a position. We transferred close to $50,000 of that to the contracts line because we did have that serviced by a contract employee rather than by an actual employee. And so the change from estimated to proposed shows at $130,000, but really $54,000 of that had been assigned to the contract line. Also noted that there's $50,000 that comes in from labor chargebacks from the general plan to help offset the additional cost of the community development director. In prior years, we weren't able to bill the full amount, but now that we are anticipating having a full-time community development director, we're anticipating being able to recover some of those charges through the general plan. We also had some salary savings from a vacant maintenance worker 1 and 2. For over 50% of the year, we had a position that was held unfilled. We're planning to fill that position in fiscal year 13-14. And then we just estimated roughly that maybe $20,000 were due to regular salary employee adjustments, people who normally get just regular step increases. That possibly if there were 8 employees who were not at top step and received 5% increases, then that would equate to that amount if they were paid close to a $50,000 salary. So that accounts for what we believe to be the $425,000. There were some additional moving pieces. But one thing is that if you take the 425 minus the 140, you come close to that 291,000, the difference that we talked about between adopted and proposed. So that kind of reconciles, brings the two to a true-up. Contract services, we show decreased primarily in response to the reduced attorney fees, and again, we have some reductions in the temporary services that we've seen, the $27,000, as well as the stormwater program management of $20,000, and then moving some of the contract services related to the community, from the community development director contracts to the community development department salaries. City Manager.
So this is some information that wasn't in your budget. As we've discussed previously, the city settled out with Lexington Insurance Company over our claims for flood damages. The settlement amount was $1.35 million. After the contingency fee payment to the lawyers, we have $1.145 million available for allocation. The recommendation that I'm making to you tonight is that we allocate those to 3 different things: debt reduction, a long-term obligation reduction, reserves, and to capital improvement projects. I'm proposing at this point a $500,000 split between the reserves, $500,000 to reduce long-term obligations, and $145,000 to CIP projects. If we were to make that change, you would see the budget numbers that you see are reflected on the left there in the table, the $463,000 for reserves and $490,000 for CIP projects. They would be increased by the amounts you see in the table. So we'd have $963,000 going into our reserve funds this year and a $635,000 capital improvement program budget. Some of the options for reducing the long-term obligations, let me take a step back. The first thing that I did was take a look at what long-term obligations the city currently has and what are the options to prepay them and what are the interest rates. The pension obligation bond is currently at about 6%, but unfortunately it doesn't include any provisions for an early payment, and the holder of the note is not willing to negotiate with the city to pay early, or the penalties that they were proposing to apply would negate any advantage to paying down that. The other debt that the city has at at a higher interest rate, if you will, is with Santa Cruz County Bank at 3.25%. We could take $500,000 and allocate it to pay that down. It would save the city about $160,000 over 20 years. In addition, it would reduce the payback period to 12 years versus 18 years is what we have left. The nice thing about that is you'll recall the Santa Cruz County Bank note was set for the first 10 years and then had a reset after 10 years. So this would limit the amount of time, the number of payments the city would make after the reset. So there's sort of a nice symmetry there in reducing our potential exposure to a rate increase down the road. However, currently with PERS, the city does have a small side fund, about a $360,000 side fund that's held by the miscellaneous employees with PERS. That's assessed at 7.5%. So there could potentially be an opportunity to negotiate something with the employee groups wherein the city could get a higher return and the employees potentially could get some benefit because of the way the city's cap on PERS contribution works. It would be an opportunity where potentially the city could get a higher rate of return and employees could get some of that benefit. And then lastly, there's been some other jurisdictions, and for those of you who sit on other regional boards and commissions, conversations about prepaying your PERS obligations. Right now we pay to PERS 26 times a year. We pay every pay period. And there is the option in any given year to pay them a lump sum for the whole estimated amount at the beginning of the year. Roughly speaking, it's about $1 million the city would pay. It would go out the door on July 1st of the year, and PERS will give you 3.75% on that money. So it's better than we would get in LAIF. The downside to it is that come our low point in city's cash flow in mid-December, is that money is gone. It's out the door. So one of the things we could do is establish a $500,000 fund to sort of mitigate that cash flow impact. The problem, though, the fly in the ointment on the PERS prepayment is that they base the amount you have to pay on your estimated payroll, which in most cases for Capitola is higher than our actual payroll has been. And the delta between the two, the delta between their estimated payroll and your actual payroll, ends up kind of going back in the kitty, if you will, and just helping to fund our overall PERS pool. So it wouldn't only benefit the city, it would benefit the other cities for whom we sit in the same PERS pool. So pretty quickly, the 3.75% return that you get can get eaten up. So it really only works in a rising payroll environment if you have MOUs that have built-in COLAs in them that are more than 3%. So that is an option, but it wouldn't make sense doing this year. If we didn't do this right now, though, I don't want to say that it wouldn't be a good thing for the city to do maybe further down the road when our reserves are more fully established and the cash flow issues are less of a big deal. In a year or two, we certainly could pursue this if we were set up right, even without making this decision to do this. And then lastly, I would point out that with the iBank rate as low as it is, paying that down wouldn't make sense as compared to the Santa Cruz County Bank, just because the iBank loan is going to be at such a low interest rate.
On the miscellaneous employee side fund, in addition to the employees benefiting by a 1% possibly reduction in what they have to pay in PERS, is that figured into the 10 to 20,000? We would get 10 to 20,000 in addition to them benefiting by about 1%.
Yeah, the net effect, as Councilmember Termini points out, would be that there'd be about a 1% take-home pay increase to employees, which would benefit them about $30,000 a year, spread out to the miscellaneous employees. They would benefit to the tune of about $30,000.
But not our 30,000.
Not our 30,000. Not our 30,000.
Still make 10 to 20.
Right. So and
they're looking at a potential 4 or 5 point increase in the next year.
Yeah, that is something we'll touch on here shortly. Is that the PERS rates are going up. There's new formulas coming out of Sacramento for the PERS rates. So this would be something that the council could consider pursuing in negotiations with the employee groups that would help to blunt some of those coming impacts.
On the contribution to the reserve fund, the $500,000, and that would bring in the next year the total addition $963,000. What are you proposing, Jamie, for future years out, and whether to maintain our current schedule to get to the $3 million goal, or to spread it spread it out over more years, so that we're not putting as much in 14, 15, 15, 16.
The number one thing I would recommend with refunding the reserves is to look ahead in our sort of longer-term fiscal projections, because in 2017 we have a number of things happening. Is the last payment on the pension obligation bond will take place, and Measure D will expire absent re-upping it. And so I think what we need to do, Tori and I need to do a little bit of analysis to try to match up these reserve contributions at that same time, so that we're making our last reserve contribution at the same time that the Measure D is expiring, and at the same time the POB is going away, so that there isn't a one-year hit in there where we end up, having a $300,000. Because, for example, the Measure D, it will expire on a calendar year basis, and the POB payments due over a fiscal year basis. So there's going to be a full POB payment that last year and only half of the Measure D. So I can't say right here, right now, whether I would recommend drawing out those payments or not. My intuition is that we would want to stay on the $500,000 a year for the next 2 years, which would get us to fully funded reserves, and then that would give us the most flexibility, I think, in that final year. But it deserves some thought.
Without the additional $500,000? If we go along with our schedule.
Without the additional $500,000, we're 3 years away. With the additional $500,000, we're 2 years away. That's the simple answer.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, maybe if we're actually leading up to making that decision, we could look at what the long-term effects are about that decision, and then and how we handle the out years in that.
Okay, that's a good point. We were actually working on a long-term cash flow to sort of talk a little bit about this tonight, and I think there was one little glitch right at the last minute, and so we punted it out to our next presentation. So we can do that. We can talk about how the reserves, how the $500,000 contribution would affect those contributions as we become fully funded and pay off the POB and Measure D expires.
Great.
Dennis?
What level was our reserves at before the flood?
Prior to the flood, the city had technically in its reserves 10% in the contingency fund and 5% of the general fund in the emergency reserves. That was about $1.8 million.
Okay. And what is there today?
I think we're close to. I think we're very close to.
With the contribution.
Go back to that slide real quick. With next year's, right now we're close to 1.5 with next year's funding, and after the retaining wall will be at 1.7.
And what are we at right now?
Right now, we anticipating ending the year at just about 1.5.
1.5 right now. Not anticipating, but what are we right now?
Yes, I would say I'd have to look to see for some transfers. We transfer money on a quarterly basis.
But that is, so we're proposing about $500,000 outside of the settlement money going into the reserves, which would take us to about $2 million in the reserves. But we do have programmed in there sort of the last flood expenditure, if you will, of repairing the retaining walls in Pat Cove for $200,000. For kids, we've debated about where the appropriate place to take the money for that is, because that was sort of the source for funding for all of the flood repairs. For consistency purposes, that's what we were thinking we would draw from.
The source of the money coming back to us and what we use the money for, it seems to me that our first move would be to at least take our reserves back to the point we were prior to the flood.
And with this allocation, we would get to about we would get beyond that with this allocation.
And that covers the retaining walls too.
Yeah, just thinking about it in my head, I think with the allocation of about $960,000, taking the $200,000 out, I think we'd be at about 2.3. Is that correct, Tori?
Yeah.
Okay.
The retaining wall costs can't be included in the iBank loan?
Do you want to talk about that?
It's just something that I think we just chose not to put in the iBank. I believe we made a decision not to place it with the iBank loan. However, we wouldn't be able to place it in the iBank loan at this point. We're very close to hopefully concluding that process, one of the things that we found out during the last stages of the application process is our property didn't appraise at what it needed to appraise at. They were willing to accept the insured value of our structure just to get us to that point. So I don't know, knowing this now, whether or not we would have qualified for the additional $200,000 or not, because we really had to push to get them to accept what our insured value is versus our actual appraiser who went out on site value.
And you will also recall that the park closure loan, there's some funding left in that, which obviously at this point we're holding in that account, but potentially could be available to reimburse this once the closure process is complete, could be used to reimburse the retaining walls as well. So for now, we thought the most appropriate place was just take it just like any other flood expenditure, and we really were bumping up against the ceiling on the I-bank. And it just didn't look like we could really pull much more money from them. More? So I think a couple things that usually I conclude these budget presentations with a little gloom and doom, and I don't want to disappoint. It's obviously a better budget picture than we've had in a number of years, which is really a positive thing. As with every year, the city relies very heavily on sales tax. Sales tax is quite a volatile source of revenue for a city. More than 50% of our revenue comes from that, and we saw year-over-year declines of 20% during the downturn. So it does make me a little bit nervous. I don't think that none of our revenue projections are anything that I'm not comfortable with. That being said, it's always a concern for us. In addition, we're pulling in $250,000 as an administrative allowance to manage the dissolution of the RDA. It's possible that over time that administrative allowance will not be available, which would be a blow. It's a big enough source of revenue at this point. It would be a blow to our overall budget picture. I have learned not to be surprised that any State Department doesn't take a very aggressive tact when evaluating the RDA dissolution, and we have to get through the state auditor, the auditor controller audits, and there are potential other shoes that could fall in that regard. We don't have at this point litigation that I would view with significant exposure outstanding to the city at this time. However, that can change, and that is something we always need to keep our eye on. I talked a little bit about the Measure D POB expiration in 2017. I think it's something we should all keep in the back of our mind about managing that transition. And lastly, as Councilmember Termini pointed out, there are programmed in PERS rates at this point, and what we're talking about is PERS rates over the next 5 years that will see significant increases. And with the city's cap, what that means is the city itself is insulated from it, but our employees are not. And it's probably not a terrific environment when you're faced with no COLA and a declining take-home pay for year in and year out. When you're looking ahead, that's all you're seeing in the horizon. So obviously the city is insulated and it's a good position to be in, but it's something we do need to be looking at, I think, as we move forward and keeping our eye on. So with that, I think we'll take a look at the schedule coming up, what we have planned here. Turn it over to Tori for that.
So tonight, just left to get direction to staff and to answer any questions. And then coming up on May 30th, go into providing responses to your questions, as well as receiving the Finance Advisory Committee recommendations. They'll be looking at the budget as well as the alternatives for the insurance proceeds and community groups. Along with looking at financial management policies, we noticed some variances between interfund borrowings between some of our existing policies. So we'll be bringing back a staff report to try to clear those up and make them consistent. We'll also be giving you the multi-year projection that Jamie spoke about. It looked like we had those pretty close to being ready, but we really wanted to bring them forward with complete explanations, and there was just something that happened at the very tail end. June 6th and June 20th, deliberations, depending on how much time you may need, with the final budget adoption date of June 27th, if it needs to go out that far.
Okay, we'll start out with some questions from council members, and then it is a public hearing, so we'll be happy to take comments from the public. So, Sam, you want to start?
Yes, if I may. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for that presentation. And Tori, thanks for spelling out those staffing positions. That was very helpful. In one of the highlighted summaries, and this is on page 4 in our packet, one of the personnel changes it refers to as the elimination of a grant-funded police officer position. That's one of the sworn officer positions that we had received the grant for several years ago. Yeah.
Yes.
And what I just want I would like to see when we come back what the cost would be to maintain that position, so that we can have some consideration of that.
Okay.
And also on the personnel, the inclusion of a environmental services manager. I would like to see maybe a job description for that particular position, and I think we got a base. Those salary costs was that all inclusive, or was that just base wage? But
That was fully weighted with salary and
fully
benefits.
loaded. Okay. So I think we have that, but I would like to see just a job description. What is this? There's a general, very short description of what this position is going to do, but maybe more filled out and threshed out. And I guess my principal question is, based on those outcomes, why couldn't we do it under a contract service if they're going to work on particularly, stormwater management projects? I did have one schedule where the debt service is identified. I'm trying to get to the first. On page 29, it's under estimated fund balances, and then also on page 30, it's also listed there. But and this is under 1314 estimated. Under debt service, we identified 2 line items. One is the pension obligation bond, and this page here, and the other is it just refers to the Pat Cove bond. Is that inclusive of both the Santa Cruz County Bank loan and the iBank loan?
No, we didn't include fund balances yet for the iBank loan. We just estimated the actual payment. Since we haven't set aside anything yet for it, we didn't show a fund balance, because really we would just have the revenues and the expenditures, a one-to-one general fund revenue going in and expenditure going out. So we could have listed it there, but we just hadn't set up the accounts because we weren't actually sure if that was going to be the true funding source. But it should be a one-to-one relationship on that one.
Okay, so at some point, I mean, it's identified in either the expenditures line items, or
yes,
we'll be able to see what the debt service load is going to be for any particular fiscal year.
Right. Yes, we'll have a separate page for that particular loan, and we did incorporate it on page 57 of the general fund transfers. We just listed parking lot financing at the estimated amount.
Okay. It feels like, I mean, it would be helpful, Jamie, when you come back with kind of our reserve status, funding of the reserve over, and looking at when the pension obligation bond ends, the Measure D ends, but then also these debt service obligations over the long term. I remember we used to get schedules about the kind of long-term debt service obligations of the city. So I think that would just be helpful for me to be able to see that. And I think that concludes my questions. Those are the points I have.
Okay. So I think we can give you a little bit of a response on a couple of them. We can bring back additional information, but the COPS grant that we got, what it resulted in is a CSO. We cut back on CSOs, and we elevated one position to a sworn police officer. So when that grant funding went away, so that elevated us to one more officer than we'd historically had. And then what we ended up doing was, when the grant expired, we ended up transitioning it back, and now we're back to 3. And in fact, we're ahead of where we used to be of 3 full-time CSOs, and previously, before this grant, we were at 2.5 CSOs. So we can come back and talk about what the delta would be between a CSO and an officer, and that sounds like what you're asking for. And then I think...
Yes, well, and I also would like to hear from the chief about, well, the impacts on losing that position, right, just so that we can weigh that as well against what the costs are for maintaining it.
And then I think Steve can talk a little bit about the environmental services manager and the role that he sees in his department.
Yeah, actually, the environmental projects manager. The state has, as we all know, has stormwater management programs that we are charged with implementing. For the last 3 years, we've been kind of limping along, doing our best with limited resources. As of February this year, the state enacted a new Phase 2 permit, which goes into effect July 1st, which has a significant increase in the amount of reporting, monitoring, and implementation that we need to do. I think at this point, for at least for the next year to year and a half, we're looking at a 30 to 40 hour a week position that we're going to need to notify, and to do that under contract services I think would be overly expensive. Kind of time-wise, we also have other environmental issues with riparian restoration work that we do. A lot of the creek work that Ed Morrison currently does, who will eventually completely retire, that this environmental projects manager will be able to overtake. So as the stormwater, we finally get a good handle on that. I still think even when we're fully up and running, it's probably a 20 to 30 hour a week job. We will have other environmental issues that will come along, and we can always increase our educational effort with that. So I do think at this point, because of the hours required, we're better off keeping it in-house than we are trying to do it under contract services.
Okay.
We will bring the job description to the next
right,
meeting.
and I could certainly see that for the particular projects that are listed, that, yeah, we could keep this person busy for a year and a half. But usually when you have salaried positions or hourly positions, they're there for the duration. So I'm looking at, long term, how are we going to handle just the workload when these particular projects are done? Is there going to be sufficient work in the out years to justify maintaining the position? Because I think, it gets, or I don't know how you would handle it as a temporary position. If that's what's being proposed, that certainly puts a bookmark at the end of these particular projects being accomplished. But that's what I would like to look at is, I think the long-term justification for this position.
And maybe I didn't state it correctly. The stormwater programs don't end. There isn't a set schedule of projects. It's an ongoing. Right now, we're entering into a new 5-year permit cycle. So the programs will continue, and we will have to continue to do them from here on out. So that aspect of that job will never end. Getting us up to speed, I think, is what's going to take a majority of this 18 months to get us up to speed where the state wants us. From then, I think it's going to be at least a 2/3 position just doing stormwater, and that's when we can backfill with what Ed does and other environmental programs that will be ongoing at that point.
Great, thank you.
Speaking of stormwater, Steve, did we ever move forward the request to Zone 5 to define what is theirs and what is ours?
We've made that request several times. I'm not sure that they've ever responded. I don't think they know.
I think we should do it formally. I think we should actually have them make a decision on what part of the storm system it is their responsibility, because if we ever come into this situation again, we want to.
Well, we have some lines. Don't forget to talk to the microphone. We also need to have the lines, when we talked about this before, the lines that we have, the drainage areas that we have maintained. There's one on 42nd. There's one by the auto dealers. They're not maintaining them. And we deserve to have them maintained so that they're working properly.
It seems to me that the county needs to hire an environmental projects manager. And I'm being a little facetious, but not really, in the fact that I'm seeing in the next 3 years, not that Public Works doesn't need the infill and getting back to full staff, but we're increasing every department by a quarter, by a half, by 1 or 2 in the next 3 years, with no increase in police. And police have been down since 07, 08. So where are we focusing? I would rather see someone added to Public Works on the street than someone in the office. We're getting back up to the place where we kept on patting ourselves on the back that we worked down from. And we went from 68 employees down to 60, and we raised the flag. Now we're moving right back up again, but we're not focusing on our 3 primary goals, which is clean, safe streets. And, I think we need to pay attention to that.
I have a personal question also. We're going to be, and this is maybe for Rich, when we're going to be revising the municipal code, who's going to do that work? Are we going to do that in-house or look at a consultant to help us with that, a very part-time consultant to help us with that?
That's currently part of the contract with DC&E and the Planning Center, but their work will be supplemented by me and community development staff.
And what's the timeline for that?
The zoning ordinance will probably come before the council in the spring of next year, is what we're targeting.
So they're looking at every ordinance, or are they looking at ones that you're pointing out to them?
No, it's the zoning ordinance.
Yeah, the zoning ordinances. Are they looking at all of them, or are they looking at what we've identified as being high priority problem areas?
No, right now it's just a zoning ordinance, and then others as the council directs.
Well, I would encourage the council members and planning commissioners to go through the zoning ordinance and identify some that we know are problems that need to be updated.
And as part of this process, we have actually done that. Ryan, Susan Westman, some of the planning commissioners have gone through and identified the specific problem areas in the zoning ordinance, and so that we have gone through and really found those sites. And it's a complete rewrite of the zoning ordinance is what this is.
So these consultants are going to be doing that?
Yeah, they're
bringing us draft ordinances?
They're drafting the ordinance, and then we'll refine it, bring it before the council for feedback, and hopefully have it adopted in the spring of next year.
Is it going to be the kind that show the cross out so we know where the changes have been made, or are they just going to be completely new ordinances? Because in a way, we might need to compare some of them.
The extent of the overhaul is going to be comprehensive enough that I think strikeout underline probably won't be user-friendly. The changes are going to be that dramatic. But I think we can certainly provide some type of summary for ease of readership so you can follow the changes.
When I've done projects like this in the past, I think what works really well is sort of table summaries, summarizing, how setbacks are changing, how uses are changing, because I think the strikeout and underline becomes a little bit meaningless when you're writing a new code, but you do want to compare in the R1 district what's changing, and is it just language and process and clarity, or is there anything substantive changing? And that's where I think what we're really talking about here is really for clarity and for process, and it's not significant
policy.
It's not significant substantive changes.
Well, at some point it would be good to have some of those discussions we've talked about for policy. And
well, certainly the door will be open to those conversations.
Because the Planning Commission over the years has brought up a number of issues of non-conforming use, especially, and that needs to be clarified, and there needs to be a real change in that policy. If you have a non-conforming use and they want to put an addition on it, do you allow them? Because then it becomes even more non-conforming. So, just that philosophical discussion, Ed Newman felt really strongly about that we were very unclear about that.
There's no question that our zoning ordinance is antiquated. Is there a holy grail of zoning ordinances out there that could be used as a pattern for change, or is this we're throwing the book out and starting anew?
I think there are certainly models that we can borrow from. My experience is that the good ones are really customized towards the community that they serve. So to take someone else's and just place a capital stamp on it probably won't work. What I anticipate is that we'll try to borrow from several different successful ordinances, the ideas, and then tailor them to our visions of the city. try to address a lot of those issues like the non-conforming uses and other problems we've identified and tackle it in that manner.
Are we talking about, when you talk about, ordinances that are tailored for a particular city and are carefully crafted, are we talking about something as amazing, magical, and arcane as a general plan undertaking?
Certainly.
Okay, good. I just want to make sure. If we ever do that, make a note.
It just makes me a little nervous having these out-of-town people, writing these ordinances when they, I don't know, they don't have our feeling or the feeling of the Planning Commission, or they don't have the benefit of those discussions, and they already did such a strange job with the general plan and calling, renaming parts of Capitola when we didn't ask them to do that.
And yet, it's as much our fault as it may be theirs, maybe more so.
Why, Zen?
Because they were working for us, and they were at our disposal.
Well, do keep in mind with the ordinances are going to be from our community development director. I mean, we have consultants preparing the text, but they're going to be ultimately things that the community development director and I are going to be recommending to the council for adoption or recommending options. So, the zoning ordinance is a highly technical piece, and as Rich pointed out, there really are models, good ordinances out there you can draw from. But, how is Arkansas going to be integrated? What's our traditions here about what projects go to the planning commissions and what don't? Capitol is unique in many of those regards, and we need to reflect that in our ordinance. And I think, to a large degree, I'm probably preaching to the choir, there's some really low-hanging fruit for improvement in our code. For example, what projects require a permit, who issues the permit, and how is the permit appealed? Those are really basic questions that a zoning ordinance should be able to answer. And I'll be honest with you, it's not 100% clear in our code. So that's some of the stuff, if we just clear up that sort of thing, what's the permit, who issues it, and how is it appealed, I think that we're doing great, even if we don't change a single setback or a single side or a single density in our zoning ordinance. Those sorts of things I think have real value.
The other part of this, Jamie, just expanding on that is, I think it goes even deeper. I think it goes back to the process itself, meaning that what is really the role of our planning commission, and are they reviewing what we need to review, and the same with Arkansas, and certainly we've seen the frustrations at our staffing level with having to deal with this code. So it may this whole section may have to go back to its roots. I mean, I can see this thing going all the way back, and I agree with you, Stephanie. I think there needs to be discussion at all levels. I don't think the city council or the planning commission have the expertise to move. They can present the problems. I don't think they have the expertise of solving the problems. And so we need our planning director to find solutions to these land use decisions that we need to make here. But I think this zoning ordinance revision may be bigger than our general plan revision in how it affects people.
But if we can go through and identify some areas that we know have been problems and give that to Jamie, he can see if it's already on the list maybe, and make sure that we're working on those things. Sam?
Well, just one follow-up budget question. When you come back, I mean, the recommendation was to put additional $145,000 of the insurance settlement into CIP. Will you come back with a recommendation of which particular projects you think should be accomplished with that funding?
We can. Steve, do you have anything prepared for this evening?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know that we need it this evening, but...
Okay, we were actually thinking of doing that this evening.
Oh,
so
you
if you'd
are?
like,
Okay.
Are you ready, Steve?
It's okay. Why don't you do it now? We'll just answer questions as they come up. Yeah.
I'd like to see it.
Then I think I'll open it up to the public for some comments or questions.
One point I did want to make in responding to Councilmember Termini's questions about the staffing levels in the police is, do recall that over the contraction that we went through between 2007-8 and where we were this current year, the number of sworn officers has remained constant, and in fact we're up with CSO. And really where the city has taken the cuts has been sort of everywhere, but the number of record clerks in the police department is down several over where we were before, and that's one of the positions we're talking about trying to bring back at a partial level.
I think the captain was a sworn employee.
You're right. I stand corrected. The captain's position has been hasn't been funded, and so you know, what we're trying to do overall as a basic philosophy is trying to look where sort of the minimum level of staffing we need to get ourselves to a sustainable level, to get our doors open 9 to 5, to get the services out the door. And, you know, Steve is operating out basically a one-person public works department, and you know, we talked about this at Ed's retirement, was what would be the position he would need if Ed were to go. And, you know, this position has been identified on his radar for several years now, that this is the position that he needs in a two-person public works department. So I understand your frustration, but at the same time, do keep in mind that overall our budgeting priorities over several years has really prioritized keeping boots on the ground and making sure that we have a very well-funded and adequately funded public safety program.
Well, speaking of public safety, I know there was on page 15 of our packet, there's a very good chart of the responses, and I was just I guess wanted to ask, and hopefully maybe when we come back, if we have any updates on what the 12-13 figures. I realize we're not done, but if we have a sense of how the numbers are looking for responses in those particular categories in this fiscal year, I think that gives us some flavor or sense of, you know, how many officers do we really need? Are we seeing more calls for service? Are they increasing? And that gives some direction about what are the impacts of now losing a sworn officer in this environment, not necessarily just compared to what we were 3 or 4 years ago.
Steve, were you going to show that?
Sorry.
So I just have a short list of projects here that we could consider for the additional funding. The first one, there's been interest recently since the Regional Transportation Commission purchased the railroad corridor, putting some improvements in at Monterey Park, which is now kind of a vacant dirt area. We've talked about putting curb and gutter all the way around there, landscaping it at this point, and trying to work with Santa Cruz Metro to put in a nice metro stop. We estimate that budget to be about $50,000, depending on what kind of shelter we put in there. It could go more. Metro has said they will look into funding it. They haven't committed to helping us trying to fund a metro stop there. There is a stop there, but a shelter, I mean. So that's one option. The second one is Hill Street pedestrian improvements. We hear several times a year about that road being too narrow. There's no sidewalks. There's parking on both sides. The solutions are to put in a sidewalk or at least a bike lane. Would involve removing parking from one side of the street. Obviously, there's a huge community outreach that needs to go on that, but that's something we could look at. Estimate, you know, $50,000 for sidewalk, for bike lanes, and kind of moving the parking around, and $100,000 if we put in sidewalks. Obviously, there's some leeway in those estimates based on what final scope of the project. And then the last one, of course, is our favorite Rispin Park improvements. In order to seek grants, which I think is the next step, once the ownership gets cleared up, we really need a good set of improvement plans of what that park's going to look like. We've kind of done it bootstrapped so far, if you will, just going out there and mothballing the building, but we really do need a complete set of improvement plans. And we can always work on the ramps, the ramp systems there to improve ADA access, which would then allow us to remove some more additional fencing. So those are just some ideas. We can always put money into more road improvements if you want.
Steve, how's your street sweeper these days?
Well, part of the budget includes in the gas tax fund a new lease option to purchase to buy a new street sweeper. So
thank you.
And sidewalk cleaning in the village is on my list of things.
So that'd be
increased.
That would be an increase in contract services.
Yeah. Dennis.
I'd like to add one to this list, and it's a discussion that this community's had for a number of years. It's the intersection of Stockton and the Esplanade, the sidewalk area there. Any person you talk to that walks into the village from neighboring communities will talk about that intersection, trying to get safely across that intersection. We have neglected doing anything with it for years. It's time that we take a step and make that safe. That's a public safety issue right there that certainly should have a higher priority than making improvements like these. I think that we need to take care of that intersection. We put it off. We discussed it. I don't know the solution to it, but it needs to be addressed. It's a public safety issue and a prime tourist as well as local pedestrian area.
Are you thinking of the crosswalk sort of in front of the lighthouse?
Yes. Yeah. It's a real difficult difficult place to cross it, particularly when you're getting towards afternoon or sunset time of the day.
Right.
The vision's line. You're going from a single lane to a double lane because of the turn stacking. People don't observe pedestrians there, and I personally have probably been close to being run over at least 6 times. So I have a personal interest in it, but I think that everybody that experiences that intersection would back me on that should be a priority in the city to fix that intersection.
Mike?
I think we spoke about this last night at the Finance Advisory Committee meeting, that perhaps giving us a debt ratio between our long-term debt and our income, just to give us some kind of benchmark that we can weigh and what is considered healthy, and that would help us determine how much, if any, of our long-term debt we want to retire, or if we want to retire more.
And we'll definitely have that at the next meeting. We have it right now. We were going to contrast it with the benchmark study and the benchmark cities.
Great. And just a note on the 2 Stockton crosswalks, I think one of them should just go away.
Ed?
Just a couple. I agree with that comment on the crosswalks. I think the Parking Commission did address those crosswalks, and that might be a good resource to go. There was some discussion about, I'm not sure what Councilman Norton has about improving that intersection, but if it is related to the crosswalks or other things, they did have a lot of conversation on that.
Good.
I think that'd be a good resource to bring that up. Number 2, I want to just make a point to commend the Public Works for reducing the pressure on the showers at the Esplanade. It's been great success. I've seen people use them and they actually stay on when you push them, and that was a relatively low budget fix. I just want to commend you for that. And the only other question I had regarding this additional employees is, there's I believe that you kind of tried to straighten us out that we are at staff, with the exception of the captain. We're fully staffed in the PD. And all these other positions that we're suggesting to add on are not that, or they're being dictated to us by additional services that we have to provide. Is that my understanding? Didn't we just do this in finance? We had to do more accounting, and I think in the waste management we contract for more accounting, and this stormwater management, it's just more demands that are being placed on us that we have to accommodate. It isn't like an option. I mean, I think that's a good way to think about it. For example, we talked at the last meeting a little bit about compliance with the Affordable Care Act, and I think you got a little peek into sort of some of the requirements for an employer on what we have to do. So what we've been looking at, there's a lot of things like that. That's just one example, and Steve's talked about the stormwater compliance. What we tried to do in this budget is really look for strategic opportunities to bring our staffing, not maybe all the way back to where we were, but boosting a few hours here and there that's going to get the maximum benefit to the city based on the changing conditions, the service demands, and on the requirements, state and federal requirements. So, for example, the environmental services manager, I think I got the title right, project manager, is being driven by mandates from the state and the federal government. What we're looking at in the police department records, boosting one of the records clerks up to from half-time to three-quarter time, is really trying to get back to a level, we're still below, but back to a level where we can just sustainably keep the office open and keep the inventory of evidence where it needs to be. So it's being dictated by, we're trying to be real strategic about it, and this isn't a question of hiring a bunch of new people. It's a few hours here and there where there maybe looks like there's a little extra bandwidth for a few employees to fill these mandates and these responsibilities.
I want to open it up to the public. You've been very patient. Would anyone like to speak tonight? Please come up to the podium. We welcome your thoughts tonight or during any of our budget hearings.
Good evening, council members and Mayor. Troy Welch, TJ Welch, 14 Escalona. Just a couple of things. I'm not going to be here for the May 30th. And just a couple areas of encouragement to you folks on the finance thing. One has to do with our staff, which we talked about tonight. And I would encourage us to continue to support our city staff. We've looked at this PERS cap, which I think the city wisely did years ago, and at least in the favor of the city itself, to a deficit of our staff members, police, and general services members. So with this, what we look at is an optimistic new budget. I would hope that we would also look at maybe offsetting some of the salary cuts that our city staff has taken by having to pay their own PERS rates, and we know they're just going to go up in the next few years. So something to consider with this extra cash that we may see coming in the lawsuit settlement and so on. So that's one area. I know you've had some discussion, but I'd encourage you to compensate our staff fairly and look at offsetting maybe some of the cuts they're taking through those PERS things. Secondly is in the area of our community grants. We talked tonight about, I think Councilmember Story was talking about some accountability with response to calls of police officers and staffing in areas. I would also ask that maybe we look at our return on investments from what we get from our community grant areas. I know it's something that all of you feel very strongly about. We've seen that over the last few years. But one area I think that we maybe put a little bit of funding to that I'd like to see us support is in our children. So I don't have, my kids are all grown and raised. I do see an area we've banned skateboarding in the city down in the Esplanade area, but yet this happens to be in an area that is very much oriented towards surf and skateboarding. I'd like to see us maybe look at an area of funding a skateboard park. I know we've said as a city that we would support a skateboard park, but I'd like to see us maybe put some money towards that. And maybe if we did something like that, we wouldn't have to spend so much money towards drug addiction program grants and so on. It's one of those areas that I think that we've spent an amount of money over the number of years through a lot of the community grants. I completely support our seniors and stuff, but I think maybe if we looked at some preventative measures, we may be able to, by having an outlet for our children, that maybe we wouldn't have to spend money like we do in our community grants towards some of the drug addiction programs and stuff like that. So just two areas of encouragement there, and good luck on the budget. Thanks.
Thanks very much, and thanks for coming down tonight. Would anyone else like to speak? Okay, I'll close the public hearing then, bring it back to the council. Would someone like to start? And any other questions or clarification or any other areas where you'd like to see some more information?
The only question I have, Madam Mayor, is that last year we started a program where the mayor and vice mayor reviewed community grants, and in view of Sam, historically recusing himself from any discussion of community grants, if you'd like to name someone to sit with you to embark on that again, I think it was a profitable endeavor.
Wow, I actually have that in a staff report for the May 30th agenda to set that as the community.
Would it help you that if we met before May 30th or after?
Well, that's
May
the
30th?
day the community grant people are coming to speak to the groups. So I don't know if you want to make...
We could review the applications at any time.
You can. I have them. I have a staff report like we usually do where it has all the applicants, what they've asked for, what is the amount, per capita and so forth. And then I made the suggestion to appoint 2 members to do the review like we did last time. I prepared it for the 30th, but I think you're probably right in that you could do that at any time, and then when the applicants come in, that's just part of your discussion, and then I could just pull that staff report.
I would encourage all the council members to review all the applications too, so that you've become familiar with them.
But from staff's position, we are recommending the formation of that subcommittee, and whether we did it tonight or whether you saw the staff report and we did it at the next meeting. Certainly, we thought it was a good process to go through and take a look at what the council's priorities and how you want to allocate your funding.
Are there any volunteers to help me with that?
I'd get together with you again. We've done it 1 year already, and since there's an opening.
Okay. And if Ed and Dennis want to also review the applications and give us some feedback before that time, you're welcome.
Will that constitute a serial meeting?
My recommendation would
Not
be to
do that?
if you have any comments, give them to me.
Do we have some new groups that apply? I'm just curious.
Probably would still be a good idea, because we already sent out the email to the community groups that the 30th is their day to come and do the presentations. So I think what I'll probably do is just modify my staff report a little bit, and I'll take out the wording about the subcommittee. I'll just say that you're already going through with that. And I have a summary of about, I think there's probably 4 or 5 new groups that applied that have never received funding, and then only a few groups who have asked for an increase in funding. I want to say it's about so this year you're at 250, and the request is at about 290, I think.
Any group, here's a silly question, any groups drop out and not ask for money?
No, nobody dropped out.
Okay, just, it's always nice to ask.
And I think
We actually had one once, so.
And I think the Human Care Alliance is planning on just making a big introductory presentation rather than individual presentations, but just to save time. But if council members have questions of an individual program, we can certainly do that. Or what I've encouraged them to do in the past, if they have something new and exciting and different that they're working on that they think we would benefit by knowing about, that they're welcome to tell us about that. But otherwise, then Mike and I can figure out a date to go over the applications and then to meet to discuss it after that. So we'll probably have a couple meetings.
And perhaps you can mention to Clay that one presentation at one meeting is sufficient.
But the new groups I would like to hear from, and I think that we all should hear from. So the new groups should be prepared to make a presentation at the meeting, 3 to 5 minutes or whatever they would like to tell us about their program, and show some slides if they'd like to do that. Any other questions about that?
Is there any consciousness of being anything but status quo on this? I mean,
they're open to an increase. So I think it depends. We have to just take a look at that, and they certainly were interested in having their funds restored after there was a $25,000 cut last year. So we'll just take a look at it.
I think we dropped groups last year, though.
We redlined a couple of groups, and we looked and we decreased funds on some. Stephanie and I looked at it very carefully, and we may see some redline groups this year as well. So it depends, and I don't think we're going to come back with some recommendation for some great leap from the status quo.
No, I agree with you, Stephanie. And as we sat through these over years, the last two may be the most comfortable. Is that the Human Care, if they do their presentation, we hear from the new groups, that would be sufficient. And if we have questions, then we can make a decision from that.
Okay, any other discussion about that? Any other questions or comments about anything? Well, then we're adjourned. Thank you all very much for being here. Thanks to the staff members and the audience members and council members for all your good work.
Dire consequences.
Pediatricians are now saying that this generation of children may be the first to have a lower life expectancy than their parents in our history, and it's because of this sedentary lifestyle.
And it's not just a question of adding more soccer practice.
The greatest increase in child obesity in our history occurred during the same 2 decades as the greatest increase in organized sports for children in our history.
So when experts talk about the need to get kids outdoors, they're not talking about encouraging them to play sports. They're talking about the unsupervised nature play of days long gone.
We were just out there running. We were just out there doing things and, building forts and playing hide and seek in the trees and climbing trees and all that. That's a very different expenditure of energy.
San Diego children's advocate Richard Louv recently visited San Francisco as part of the whirlwind of activity created by his 2006 book, Last Child in the Woods. In it, he coined the term nature deficit disorder to describe this modern-day plight.
Well, nature deficit disorder is not a known medical diagnosis. Maybe it should be, but not quite yet. We now know from a decade of studies that nature experience is terrific for the ability to learn. It's great for creativity, it's great for physical health, it's great for emotional health. So when you take the benefits of nature away from kids, it seems to me that that's what nature deficit disorder is.
Louv's book has sparked a nationwide movement dubbed Leave No Child Inside, which has mobilized lawmakers, state parks, and nonprofit groups. These children from San Francisco's Hunters